folder with the lease agreement sat on the kitchen counter for 11 days before Owen Callahan finally moved it. Not because he forgot it was there. He saw it every morning when he made coffee, every evening when he came in from the garage with grease still on his hands and his daughter already in bed. He moved around it the way you move around, something you have not yet decided how to feel about. The papers said what they said. The marriage was over. Rachel had retained a lawyer, a sharp one out of Vancouver who specialized, according to the firm's website, in high-value asset division. Owen had no high-value assets. That was apparently the entire point. He picked up a pen on the 12th day, a Tuesday evening in November, the kind of cold that comes off the water in Nanaimo and settles into the bones of older houses. He read the dissolution agreement once, the language of it measured and bloodless, and then he set the pen down, picked it up again, and signed his name in the one place they had asked him to sign. The part that ended the marriage itself. Nothing more. Rachel's attorney had sent a covering note that was almost kind in the way these things sometimes are, when the person writing them is very good at their job. Owen folded the note along its crease and put it in the recycling bin, because it deserved to be in the recycling bin, and because being decent about it was the only thing left that was entirely his to control. His daughter was 8 years old. Her name was Nora. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She was asleep upstairs when he signed his name, unaware of what was being assembled around her life by people in offices who had never once watched her try to catch a fish off the dock behind his parents' old place in Parksville. Owen was 41. He was a marine systems engineer by training and a freelance one by necessity, which meant he took contracts when they suited him and turned them down when they didn't, and for the past 6 years. The contracts that didn't suit him were the ones that took him away from school pickups and weekend hockey and the particular ritual of Thursday dinners, where Nora was allowed to choose anything she wanted and almost always chose breakfast foods. He had built his professional life around the edges of hers with the same patience and precision he brought to the technical work. Slowly, without drama, the way structures get built when they are meant to last. The other thing Owen had built, in the back room he used as an office, over the better part of 4 years, was a software system for remote vessel monitoring. Not a product anyone had asked for, exactly. A solution to a problem he had watched clients struggle with for a decade, managing fleets of marine vessels across the fractured geography of the BC coast, where connectivity dropped and safety data got siloed and the people responsible for those vessels spent enormous amounts of money learning things too late. He had started sketching the architecture in spare hours. He moved into real code somewhere around year 2, quiet evenings after Nora was asleep, weekends when Rachel was at conferences or client dinners or wherever Rachel went when she went places and stopped explaining. He had funded it himself carefully. His grandfather had left him a small piece of property outside Ladysmith that he had sold a few years before the marriage turned cold. The money had gone into a separate account, one he had never merged with their joint finances. Not out of strategy, but out of a simple privacy he had always kept around the things he built alone. From that account, he bought the development tools, the server infrastructure, the software licenses. He registered the intellectual property in his own name, told himself it was administrative housekeeping, and went back to work. Rachel had never asked what he did in that room. Early in the marriage, she might have. There had been a version of them that was curious about each other. But Rachel Donovan had become, over the years of their marriage, a woman for whom curiosity had a budget, and the budget did not extend to her husband's hobby. She was a commercial real estate developer with offices in Vancouver and a reputation that had grown considerably while Owen stayed home and managed Nora's world. She was excellent in what she did, and she was aware of it, and at some point awareness had become something harder to live beside. She had not married a man who stayed home. Or she had. And then she had experienced staying home as a kind of drag on the life she was accumulating without him. The word freelance, when she used it to describe him at professional dinners, carried a silence after it that he had learned not to fill. The night she told him, there had been no argument. She had come home from a late dinner, set her coat over the back of a chair, and told him the way you tell someone a meeting has been rescheduled. She had already spoken to a lawyer. The marriage was not working. There was no reason to drag it out. She was very calm. She had rehearsed the calm the same way she rehearsed presentations, until it came out clean and decisive and left no room for a question to get its foot in the door. Owen stood in the kitchen and understood several things in the space of a few seconds. He understood the decision was old. It was not a moment of crisis. It was the formal announcement of a verdict that had been delivered months ago in a room he had never been invited into. He understood she had not mentioned the name that had appeared with new frequency on her phone. A partner at a development firm in Calgary, introduced once at a charity event as someone she had done business with. He understood that the name was beside the point anyway. The marriage was what it was, and what it was had stopped being worth defending somewhere in the years between her first office and her third. What he had not been prepared for was what came 3 days later in the formal proposal from her attorney. Primary custody of Nora was listed under Rachel's column. The family home in Nanaimo was listed under Rachel's column. The investment accounts and the business revenue they had shared across the marriage were listed under Rachel's column. Owen was offered structured access. A schedule, every other weekend and 1 evening per week, referred to in the document as a regular and meaningful opportunity for the child to maintain her relationship with her non-custodial parent. Non-custodial parent. He read the phrase twice. He had driven Nora to school on 4-6-3 consecutive mornings, a number he knew because she had started counting in kindergarten and turned it into a game. He knew which lunch combination she would eat and which she would quietly set aside. He had sat with her through an ear infection that lasted 10 days, and a fear of the dark that lasted 2 years, and a brief but intense obsession with marine mammals that had required several trips to the library and one very long conversation about why orcas in captivity behave differently from wild ones. He had been there, every day, in the particular and unglamorous way that does not photograph well but shapes a child's sense of what the world is made of. None of that left a paper trail a judge could read. He sat with the proposal at the kitchen table for a long time. Nora was in the living room with a book, narrating something under her breath the way she did when she was working out the plot of what she was reading. He listened to the soft sound of her voice and felt the word non-custodial sit in his chest like a piece of hardware installed incorrectly. Wrong weight, wrong shape, wrong shape. He could take the easy road. He had looked at it. It was wide and well lit, and it led somewhere bearable. He could sign. He could absorb the unfairness the way men absorb unfairness, quietly, because the cost of fighting looked larger from the outside than the cost of losing. He could be a weekend father, and he could be fine eventually, probably, in the way that people are eventually fine about things that are never actually fine. The thing that closed the easy road came on a Wednesday night. He had done the full bedtime routine, bath and book, and the particular stuffed seal, its name a matter of Nora's invention, that had to be arranged on the left side of the pillow. He was sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark when she reached across and put her hand on his arm. Her grip was serious, the way children's grips are when they want to be sure you are listening. She said quietly, "Dad, are you still going to be my dad when you don't live here anymore?" It was not a dramatic question. She was 8, and 8-year-olds ask the questions that are actually the questions, without the adult habit of packaging them in something more manageable. He answered her steadily, which cost him more than she knew. "I'm always going to be your dad," he said. "That part doesn't change. I promise you that, okay? That part never changes." She nodded and seemed satisfied the way children are satisfied by certainty rather than explanation. She was asleep within minutes. Owen sat in the dark of her room for a long time after. Through the window, the lights of the harbor were faint and still. In the hallway outside, somewhere in the machinery of the house, a draft moved, and the papers on the kitchen counter sat where he had left them, and lawyers were drawing a box 2 weekends wide and calling it fatherhood. And he understood with a clarity he had not felt in months that he could survive almost anything they took from him except the thing he had just promised not to lose. He was not going to sign a single line of their proposal. What replaced the easy road was not anger. He was not an angry person, and even if he had been, anger was not useful here. What came instead was the same quietness that had carried him through 4 years of midnight code, deliberate, methodical, focused on the next brick. If their argument was that a man without a documented income could not provide a stable home for his daughter, Then he needed to become someone a document could describe. He asked around carefully, the way he did everything, and one name came back from two separate sources. A family law attorney in Victoria, a man who had spent 20 years in high-conflict family cases and whose reputation arrived in a single phrase, politely relentless. He had never lost a custody matter when the facts were on his side. His name was Gareth Swan, and his assistant answered the phone as though the call had already been expected. Owen introduced himself in 2 sentences. He said he believed his wife intended to remove his daughter from his daily life, and that her legal team was counting on him being too tired and too financially modest to mount a real challenge. There was a pause on the other end that was not hesitation, just assessment. "Mr. Callahan," Gareth said, "most people call me about the house. Tell me what you actually care about." They met the following morning. Gareth read the proposal with the flat, professional attention of someone who had read thousands of documents designed to make the wrong thing sound reasonable. He set it down and told Owen, without warmth or apology, exactly where he stood. "On paper, you are a liability," he said. "No fixed employment, no salary, no assets in your name that they haven't already found. Her team is not going to attack your parenting. That would be transparent, and they're not amateurs. They're going to express concern, warm, reasonable concern. They're going to suggest that a man who has structured his career around his wife's household cannot independently provide for a child. They'll phrase it gently, which is what makes it effective. And if I told you about a software project, tell me about it." He told him everything. The sale of the Ladysmith property. The separate account untouched by the marriage's shared finances. The 4 years of development funded from that account alone. The intellectual property filed under his name, in his name, no other. Gareth listened without interrupting. When Owen finished, he leaned back and was quiet for a moment. "That's better than you realize. But don't mistake material for a defense yet. British Columbia family law begins from the assumption that anything created during a marriage is family property, regardless of who built it or whose hands it came from. That assumption is not your friend. What you have just described is the raw material to challenge it. Separate origin funds, separate registration, work performed outside shared marital time, each one is an argument. My job is to build enough of those arguments that their side cannot knock them down faster than I can raise them." He fixed Owen with a look that was not unfriendly, but was entirely serious. "I need every record, every receipt, every time step, every bank statement. We are going to take the invisible and make it visible, and we are going to do it entirely on paper because paper is what courts can read." Before Owen left, Gareth gave him one instruction that he had not expected. "Sign the dissolution," he said. "The part that ends the marriage. Sign it and only that, without argument or condition. A man who fights to stay married when his wife is leaving reads badly to a judge. Sign 1 page, let them read into it whatever they like and touch nothing else. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a negotiation is let the other side believe they have already won." 2 weeks later, in a boardroom on the 18th floor of a tower in downtown Vancouver, Owen did exactly that. He signed the dissolution in silence, no argument, no visible emotion, with Nora asleep in a car seat in the parquet because he had not had anyone to leave her with, and Rachel's attorney had not objected to her waiting downstairs. He shouldered his jacket and left without looking back, and every person in that room understood they had watched a man surrender. He had given up nothing that mattered. The following weeks were a particular kind of war, the kind fought entirely in administrative language by people who carry leather folders. Rachel's legal team, funded through the considerable institutional resources of her development company, never raised its voice. It applied pressure at the joints instead. They requested that Owen undergo a psychological assessment, presented as routine, framed as something any responsible court would want to ensure. The implication beneath the courtesy was not subtle. Was the primary caregiver stable? Was he managing well? Could a man whose professional identity had been organized around the domestic life of a marriage be trusted to provide independent and sustainable care for a child on his own? The question was a trap, because it had no clean answer. To object was to appear defensive. To comply without comment was to accept that the question was legitimate. There were also the cancellations. Access was never formally obstructed, it was simply adjusted. A pickup arranged for Saturday became a pickup on Sunday due to a scheduling matter that was not explained. A full weekend was reduced to a single afternoon because Nora had come down with something, though when Owen called to check on her, she sounded fine and asked him 4 times when he was coming. The adjustments were individually small. Collectively, they were a kind of slow compression, a steady pressure applied exactly where it hurt most. He understood what was happening. She was calculating how many of these frictions he could absorb before the cost of fighting exceeded the cost of losing. She was, professionally, very good at that kind of calculation. He did not stop fighting. He also did not sleep much. The thing that changed the shape of everything arrived on a Thursday afternoon in Gareth's office in Victoria, delivered in a sentence that Gareth spoke while reading something on his computer with an expression Owen had learned to pay attention to. "Mr. Callahan, were you aware that there is a letter of interest from a technology investment group regarding your maritime monitoring system?" Owen went still. "I wasn't." Gareth turned the screen toward him. A Vancouver-based fund, active in marine technology infrastructure, had expressed interest in the platform. The letter used the word acquisition. The valuation mentioned in the preliminary language had 8 figures in it. "Did you pitch this to them?" "No. I put the core code base into an open repository under my own name about 8 months ago. A technical transparency decision. I wanted to see if the architecture would hold up under scrutiny from people who knew the domain. I never approached a fund. I never told anyone it was for sale. I hadn't even finished it yet." Gareth was already pulling up a second screen. "There's something I want you to sit with," he said. "I have spent 2 decades watching coincidences that are not coincidences. I have the timestamps on Rachel's initial filing. I have the first correspondence between her attorney and her firm's in-house counsel, and I have something else." He aligned 3 documents on his screen. "There is a thread of contact between her firm and the investment group that surfaced this interest. Not direct. Through a mutual professional acquaintance, a development consultant she has worked with for 2 years. Owen looked at the documents. He looked at Gareth. "She knew about the platform," he said. "I am saying the timing is not an accident. She did not file slowly and then discover your good fortune at an inconvenient moment. She moved decisively and well ahead of what the situation required, because the moment a platform valued in 8 figures becomes a documented asset, it belongs on the table, divided under the eyes of a judge. It is far cleaner to finalize a divorce from a man everyone agrees has nothing before anyone outside that back room knows what he was actually holding." Owen sat with that for a long time. He had spent months feeling like a man who had been quietly discarded, the husband who stayed home, the engineer who did not advance his career, absorbing the loss because decent men absorb things. He had even, in the honest dark of some of those nights, pitied himself a little and felt ashamed of the pity. That was not the story. It had never been the story. He was not a man being set aside. He was an asset being moved off the books by someone who had understood his value before he did and had built a strategy around getting out before that value became something she would have to fight him for in the open. The pity drained out of him like cold water, and something much quieter and more precise moved in to replace it. Gareth watched his face and seemed satisfied with what he saw. "Good," he said simply. "Now let's go find the thread." Rachel escalated when she realized he would not fold. It was subtle at first, the kind of movement that looks like market caution rather than strategy. Through the professional circles around the acquisition, a question began to circulate about the project's IP status. Was the ownership clean? Was the founder's situation complicated? Were there unresolved claims that would present diligence problems for a fund? The question arrived in different mouths at different lunches and networking events, but it originated from a small number of places, and Gareth's people began tracing those places. Then Rachel came to him in person. Owen had taken a furnished apartment in Nanaimo, 2 bedrooms, because Nora needed a room of her own when she stayed. He was at the table reviewing records one evening when the knock came. Nora was asleep. He opened the door, and Rachel was standing in the corridor in her work coat, the one she wore when she wanted to remind the room that she had made deliberate choices with her life. He stepped back to let her in because Nora was sleeping and he would not do this in a hallway. She looked around the apartment in the way people who are very good at assessing property look at property. Then she made her offer, and she made it carefully because making offers was something she did exceptionally well. There was a settlement available, modest but fair, a confidentiality provision. He would step back from the acquisition process and she would remove the professional interference that was currently slowing it. He would accept a reduced custody arrangement, structured and clearly documented. In exchange, the dispute would end. The fund would be allowed to complete its process. He would have money. It was, she said, a better outcome than a court fight he was unlikely to win. "You are a genuinely good father, Owen," she said, and her voice carried something close to sincerity. "That is real. But this other thing, this acquisition, this is not your world. Don't walk into a room built for different people and pretend the walls aren't there." He looked at her for a moment. The woman he had married when neither of them was anyone in particular, who had counted every card in the deck and miscounted the one that mattered. "Go home, Rachel," he said. She looked at him for a long beat, recalibrating, and then she left. Her footsteps were measured down the corridor. The door settled closed. He sat alone at the table afterward and let the doubt arrive, because he had learned not to pretend it wasn't there. He wondered about Nora. He wondered whether the thing he was fighting for was worth what it was costing her. The confusion of split arrangements, the legal machinery grinding through the background of her life. He wondered whether a child needed a father who won, or whether she needed the simpler thing, a father who was simply always there. He did not have the answer. He only had the promise. And so he kept working. The bottom fell out 10 days before the hearing. A technology journalist, working from what appeared to be a tip, published a short piece online describing the pending acquisition of Owen's platform as being complicated by unresolved intellectual property questions arising from an active family law dispute. The language was precise, in a way that suggested it had been refined before it was handed over. Within 24 hours, the investment group had issued a statement indicating they were pausing the process pending legal review. An 8-figure offer does not disappear in a day, but it can go cold, and Owen felt it cooling as he read. The same afternoon, Rachel's legal team filed an emergency motion to freeze all assets related to the software project for the duration of the family proceedings. Gareth called in the early evening. His tone was level, which Owen had learned to read as Gareth's version of concerned. If the court grants the freeze, the acquisition stalls, possibly past the point of recovery. The fund won't wait indefinitely, and without the acquisition, we're arguing custody with a man who has, on paper, no assets and no salary, which is exactly where they wanted you from the beginning. He paused. "I won't tell you it can't be won from there. But I'll tell you the road got longer." Owen stood at the window of the apartment and looked at the street below and thought about a Wednesday night 2 months ago, and a small hand on his arm and a question about whether he would still be her dad. Then Gareth spoke again. "There's one more thing. I've had people going back through the journalist's article. The specific IP language, the phrasing around the divorce timeline, that information doesn't exist in public court filings. It was internal. It was known to Rachel, and it was known through the professional channel she uses to the consultant connected to the fund. Someone handed that article its shape. We know whose hands are the right size for it." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Then we prove it," he said. "Already started," Gareth said. The morning of the hearing was the kind of November morning the BC coast does when it wants to be beautiful, cold, and clear. The mountains across the strait pale blue against a pale blue sky. Owen had laid his clothes out the night before. He had made Nora's breakfast, driven her to his sister's in Parksville, crouched at the car door to fix a zip that had come undone on her jacket. She had asked him if today was the important day. He told her it was one of them. She told him she had saved him some of her Halloween candy for when it was over, the good kind, and he had laughed, which was the right thing to do. He was at the curb outside his apartment when a car pulled up. He had heard the name Ian Voss in the context of West Coast Marine Investment, the way you hear names in a field, attached to deals and industry events, belonging to a face you haven't met. Voss was the lead principal at the fund behind the acquisition, and Owen had assumed, as you assume about people who move that kind of capital, that they did not show up on streets like his for matters as personal as a custody hearing. But here he was, in a Range Rover, leaning to push the passenger door open from inside. "Get in," Voss said. We've got time, but court steps are political. You want to be early enough that people see you arrive. Owen got in. They drove for several blocks in a silence that did not feel uncomfortable. Voss had the manner of a person accustomed to letting spaces breathe before he filled them. One of my analysts, he said finally, spent 3 weeks working through open-source repositories looking for undervalued infrastructure in the marine sector. She came across your system, flagged it to me as the cleanest architecture she'd seen for the problem space in 5 years, and it was just sitting there, in public, attached to a real name, with no pitch deck and no contact form and no one trying to sell it. He glanced over briefly. I've been pitched 10,000 products. Nobody who has something real leads with nothing. It made me want to know what kind of person builds that way. A few blocks from the courthouse, he pulled over and stopped the car. Come around, he said, getting out. He held the driver's door open and waited. Owen looked at him. He understood the structure of what was being offered, the gesture inside the strategy, the kindness inside the tactic. He slid behind the wheel. Voss got into the passenger seat without ceremony. The courthouse steps had gathered the kind of quiet attention that forms around anything that involves both family law and technology money. Local reporters knew the name Ian Voss, and Voss emerging from the passenger side of a vehicle driven by the man everyone had agreed had nothing was a detail that did its own work without requiring explanation. Rachel's lead attorney was already on the steps, files under her arm, absorbing what she was seeing. The consultant connected to the whole arrangement was near the doors, hands in his pockets, with the settled expression of a man who believed he had come to watch something already decided. Owen stepped out of the car and crossed the pavement and walked up the steps and through the doors. And behind him, he heard Voss's footsteps and the murmur that moved through the small crowd. The way murmurs do when a room is revising what it thought it understood. The courtroom was formal and unhurried. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with the particular patience of someone who has watched people perform certainty for many years and remains unimpressed, listened to Rachel's legal team open their case with the precision and warmth that Gareth had predicted weeks earlier. A devoted father, certainly. An engaged parent, no question. But a man without a stable professional foundation, without documented earnings, without independent assets, asking a court to place primary custody in a household that could not demonstrate what a child's future there would look like. They were careful. They were good. Then Gareth stood. He did not raise his voice for the duration of what followed. He laid 3 timelines on the record. The first was Rachel's filing date and the early correspondence between her attorney and her firm's internal legal team. The second was the development timeline of Owen's platform. The origin of funds, the account records, the IP registration date, the repository publication date. The third was the first documented contact between Rachel's professional network and the investment group that had produced the acquisition interest. The 3 timelines, placed next to each other, told a story that did not require interpretation. The respondent did not move to dissolve this marriage and then later discover that an asset existed, Gareth said in the quiet voice of someone reading a weather report. The respondent moved to dissolve this marriage specifically because she became aware that an asset was about to surface. The urgency of the filing, the targeting of the dissolution's financial terms, the professional pressure applied to the acquisition negotiations, and the origin of the media report that temporarily disrupted those negotiations are not coincidences operating independently. They are components of a coordinated strategy. He produced the documentation of the media tip's origin, traced step by step through the consultant's professional connections, time-stamped, sourced, attached to a specific conversation in a specific week. Rachel's attorneys objected 3 times. The judge allowed Gareth to continue twice and sustained the third. Something changed in the room, slowly and without announcement, the way temperatures change in an enclosed space. The 2 attorneys at Rachel's table had begun to communicate in the compressed, minimal way of people who have discovered mid-argument that their foundation is not what they were told it was. Outside, through the narrow window in the courtroom door, Owen caught a glimpse of the consultant crossing the lobby at a pace that was not running, but was not walking in the direction of anything. Gareth closed the asset question with the records Owen had handed him over 3 months of careful preparation. The inheritance from his grandfather, received and documented before the marriage. The separate account, untouched by shared finances, Receipted across 4 years of purchases. The IP registration, dated, named, filed. The timestamps on the development work, drawn from server logs and commit histories, all falling outside the hours the household shared. British Columbia family law begins from the assumption that property created during a marriage is family property, Gareth acknowledged without apology. That assumption is not unreasonable, but it is a default, not an absolute. And the default falls when the record demonstrates separate origin, separate funding, and development conducted outside the shared resources of the marriage. This platform does not belong to both parties. It belongs to one party, and the attempt to freeze it is an attempt to capture something that was never jointly held. When he sat, the room held its quiet for several seconds. The judge turned to Owen. She set aside the filings and looked at him directly, the way judges do when they have decided they need to hear the person and not the representation. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I'd like to hear from you, not your counsel. Set aside the financial matter for a moment. Tell me why you are here." Owen stood. His hands were still and he did not look at Rachel. "About 2 months ago," he said, "I was putting my daughter to bed. We'd done the whole routine, book and bath, and the stuffed seal she needs on a particular side of the pillow. And she reached across in the dark and put her hand on my arm and asked me if I was still going to be her dad after I didn't live at the house anymore." His voice was level. He kept it level. "She's 8. She wasn't being dramatic. She asks me things like that, the same way she asks about why whales sing or whether clouds have a bottom. But I've thought about that question every single day since. I told her that part doesn't change, that I promised her. Everything I've done since then, I've done because I am not willing to be the reason the answer to that question turns out to be no. I'm not asking for primary custody because of what I built, Your Honor. I'm asking because I have been there, every day and every way that actually mattered to her, and because my daughter should not have to wonder about that." The room was very quiet. The judge looked at him for a moment that held. Then she made a note, and the proceeding continued. The rulings came in sequence. The emergency motion to freeze assets was denied. The acquisition, the court found no cause to obstruct, would proceed. Primary custody was awarded to Owen, with Rachel receiving a structured and defined schedule of access. On the underlying asset question, the court accepted Gareth's argument. The maritime monitoring platform had been developed using premarital non-commingled funds, outside shared marital time, and registered independently throughout. It was Owen's separate property. Rachel received her equitable share of the actual joint estate and nothing beyond it. Owen watched Rachel receive the ruling without expression. She was still composed. She was always composed. The only thing that had changed was something behind the composure. A stillness that had not been there in the boardroom on the 18th floor. The stillness of a person who has run a precise calculation and found an error too late to go back and correct it. On the courthouse steps in the November light, Ian Voss was waiting with his hands in his jacket pockets. He offered his hand, and Owen took it. "I came this morning because I had already made the decision about the platform," Voss said. That was settled. "I came because I wanted to see how you carried yourself under that kind of pressure. I've done enough of these to know that the product and the person come together. You can't separate them." He held the handshake a moment longer. "Paperwork this week. Welcome to what comes next." The deal closed 3 weeks later. Owen did not market in any visible way. He did not post anything, call anyone to announce it, or change the rhythm of his days in any immediate fashion. What he did with the first significant money of his adult life was buy a small house on the edge of town, not far from the water, close enough that on still mornings you could smell the salt from the back porch. It was a modest place, a bungalow with a yard that had gone to seed and a workshop at the back that would need work. It had a room that could be Nora's, in a way that was permanent, not transitional, not a guest room being used as a bedroom, but actually hers, with a door she could close and a window that looked toward the water. He moved in on a Saturday. Nora was with him. She chose her room in approximately 45 seconds with the directness of someone who had not yet developed the adult habit of pretending deliberation. He let her pick the paint color. She chose a blue-green that she described as what the inside of a wave looked like, and he looked at the paint chip and thought she was probably right. He cooked dinner the first night the way he always had, because routine had held him through everything, and he saw no reason to set it aside now. They ate breakfast food because it was Nora's choice, and breakfast food was almost always her choice. He helped her with a reading assignment at the kitchen table. He found the stuffed seal and installed it correctly. And when she was asleep and the house had gone quiet, he carried a cup of tea out to the back porch and sat in the cold November air and let himself feel for a while the simple, unremarkable weight of having kept his word. He saw Rachel at a school concert in February, a gymnasium with folding chairs and the good-natured chaos of children doing their best on a small stage. She was there with her own circle, composed and polished as always, though there was something in how she carried herself that was different, a kind of careful maintenance that had not been there before, as though she were holding something together that used to hold itself. He had heard, in the quiet way information travels in small cities, that the professional relationship with the consultant had not survived what the court proceedings had made visible. He did not think about it much. They stood near the back of the gymnasium after the program ended and exchanged a few minutes of civil conversation about pickup schedules and an upcoming school trip, and whether Nora had told him yet about the project she was working on, the one about harbor seals. She had. He knew all about it. When the crowd began to thin and parents started collecting their children, Rachel turned to leave and then stopped. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to name precisely. Not regret, not quite. Something more like the face of a person who has run the numbers again and arrived at a different sum. "I didn't realize how far along it was," she said quietly. "The platform. I knew it existed. I didn't know it was what it was." Owen looked at her. There were things he could have said. There had been a time not that long ago when he might have wanted to say some of them. "I know," he said. He crossed the gymnasium to where Nora was waiting with a drawing she had made during the quieter parts of the concert. A seal with an improbable number of whiskers. She handed it to him with the solemn satisfaction of someone delivering something that had been made specifically for this moment. He took her hand, and they walked out through the gymnasium doors into the February cold, and the night was ordinary and quiet and entirely theirs. I keep thinking about the moment Owen sat on the edge of his daughter's bed in the dark, after she'd asked him whether he'd still be her dad when he didn't live there anymore. That question didn't come wrapped in drama. It came the way a child asks about clouds or tides, simply, directly, because she actually needed to know. And I think that's the moment the whole story turned, not in the courtroom, not when the acquisition closed, but in that quiet room, in that ordinary dark, when one person made a promise and decided to mean it completely. What strikes me most isn't that Owen won, it's how he won and what he refused to do along the way. He had every reason to take the easy road. The proposal Rachel's team put in front of him was technically accurate. On paper, he looked exactly like what they said he was. No salary, no fixed contract, no assets a judge could easily read. The unfair thing about invisible work is that it leaves no record. You can spend 6 years being the person a child depends on most, and none of that shows up in a column a courtroom can weigh. But Owen understood something that I think a lot of us miss when we're standing in that kind of situation. He understood that how you respond to an injustice matters as much as whether you survive it. He didn't sign under pressure. He didn't take Rachel's late-night offer, even when it was dressed up in something that almost sounded reasonable. He held to what he knew was true, not because he was certain it would work, but because letting Nora down was the one outcome he couldn't live with. That's not stubbornness. That's integrity operating under real conditions, where the cost of it is actual and the reward is not guaranteed. And then there's the platform itself. 4 years of work done after the house went quiet, funded from his own inheritance, registered in his own name, built without asking anyone's permission or seeking anyone's approval. He wasn't hiding it. He simply hadn't finished it yet. He was the kind of person who builds things properly before he talks about them. And in the end, that quality, that patient, precise, unglamorous commitment, was the same quality that held him together when everything around him was designed to make him fold. The character that built the software was the same character that walked up those courthouse steps. What Rachel miscalculated, I think, was exactly that. She counted Owen's quietness as passivity. She read his patience as the absence of ambition. She moved fast because she assumed he wouldn't. And when a person makes decisions based on a fundamental misreading of someone else's nature, the consequences tend to arrive late and all at once. I've watched enough of these situations, In stories, in real life, to believe that the outcomes people eventually face are rarely random. They grow from choices. Rachel's choices were sharp and strategic and built on treating another person's value as something to be extracted before it was recognized. Owen's choices were slower and less visible and built on keeping faith with a small girl who needed to know her dad would still be there. Those two sets of choices didn't produce equal results. They couldn't have. What I take from Owen's story is something I find myself returning to. That real strength tends to be quiet. That the work you do without an audience is often the work that carries the most weight when it finally has to. That when someone you love asks you a question in the dark, the answer you give them is not a small thing. It's the whole shape of who you're deciding to be. Nora handed him a drawing of a seal with too many whiskers, and he took her hand, and they walked out into the February cold. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. Not the deal, not the ruling, just that.